There is something uncanny about the truly intelligent soul, not because it knows more, but because it sees more, and to see deeply in this world is to walk alone. There is a quiet strangeness that surrounds the highly intelligent. Not loud, not boastful, a stillness, a subtle gravity. To the untrained eye they appear aloof, withdrawn, but this is not arrogance, nor is it coldness. It is discernment. What most people mistake for emotional distance is, in truth, a kind of sacred boundary, erected not to exclude others, but to preserve the soul's dialogue with itself. You see, intelligence, true intelligence, is not merely cognitive. It is psychological, emotional, symbolic, and those who possess it deeply are often drawn away from the noise of the world, not because they dislike others, but because they are listening to something quieter, something older. The soul. In my work I called this the process of individuation, the long, often painful journey by which a person becomes themselves, not the self given by parents or society or even romantic love, but the self with a capital S. The eternal blueprint imprinted within, buried beneath conditioning, fear, and collective expectation. This journey requires solitude, not as escape, but as initiation. The intelligent person senses this intuitively. While others flee silence, they enter it. While the crowd seeks validation, they seek integration. They are not antisocial. They are alchemists, turning silence into meaning and solitude into strength. This detachment is not cold, it is warm with the heat of awareness. It is not avoidance, it is preparation for the world, for love, for the truth of one's own depths. The masses project, they live in mirrors, constantly reflecting and reacting. But the individuated soul turns inward, where archetypes live, where the unconscious whispers symbols in dreams, and where one meets not only who they are, but who they could become. That is the great secret. The intelligent person retreats, not to vanish, but to evolve. For in the stillness they are not hiding, they are being forged. Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakens. The path is narrow, the crowd will call you strange, but if you endure the loneliness of truth, you will become what few ever dare to be. Yourself. But here lies the crux, a truth that intelligent minds often stumble upon, not with arrogance, but with quiet sorrow. The deeper your awareness grows, the more you perceive that much of what passes for human connection is not connection at all. It is performance, a dance of personas. It is projection meeting projection, unconscious need seeking unconscious fulfillment, all cloaked in the illusion of intimacy. And once this truth is seen, it cannot be unseen. This realization presents a profound psychological crossroads. One path invites you to continue participating in the collective place, smiling when you are weary, agreeing when your soul protests, engaging in rituals that nourish the ego but starve the self. The other path, lonelier, quieter, and infinitely more real, calls you to step back, to withdraw not in bitterness but in reverence, to create an inner sanctuary where your essence is no longer diluted by expectation, but refined by solitude. Most cling to the former, gripped by the fear of social death, the terror of being misunderstood, abandoned, forgotten. But the intelligent, those who have glimpsed the architecture of the psyche, often choose the latter, not because they are above the world, but because they are being called into their own. This is the burden of true intelligence, not merely to think clearly, but to see deeply, to see behind the masks others wear. And behind the mask you once called your identity. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. And so, the intelligent mind retreats, not out of disdain, but out of necessity. It needs space, not physical space, but psychic space to individuate, to integrate, to listen to the subtle murmurs of the soul rather than the thunder of the crowd. And this is not loneliness, it is transformation. And then, quietly, irrevocably, you begin to see, you see the hidden architecture behind casual words. You hear what is not said, feel what is not acknowledged, the laughter that conceals shame, the kindness that masks control, the praise that veils possession. you begin to notice that much of what people call love is merely a transaction of needs dressed in the language of care, but rooted in fear. This is what I called the birth of psychological consciousness, that subtle but profound shift in which the eye of the soul opens inward, and one begins to perceive the unconscious not only within oneself, but in the world. You no longer observe behavior, you observe motivation. You no longer ask, "What are they doing?" but rather, "What wound are they trying to hide?" And once this inner eye awakens, you cannot close it. You walk through the world as one who sees the strings behind the puppets, the script behind the actors. It is not that others are false, but that they are unaware, still possessed by the archetypes, still entranced by inherited patterns. You sit at tables where others laugh, and you notice who is performing, who is retreating, who is starving for approval but pretending to be full. You see the child inside the adult, the anima behind the anger, the shadow behind the smile. This awareness does not make you superior, it makes you solitary. It births a strange isolation, not of geography, but of perception. You feel as though you are watching a play, brilliant, tragic, beautiful, and you are the only one who remembers it is, in fact, a play. Not because it isn't real, but because it is all so deeply unconscious. You see the masks, and you long to touch the face beneath, and here lies the quiet tragedy of awakening. The more clearly you see, the fewer people you can speak to. Not because they are unworthy, but because they are still asleep, still dreaming, still calling the dream truth. But this is not cynicism, it is clarity. To see clearly is not to condemn, but to carry what others have not yet named. To walk through illusion with the patience of a soul that remembers. The self is not born in applause, but in solitude, in silence, in suffering, and in the slow, deliberate peeling away of every lie you once mistook for love. And clarity, while a light in the darkness, is not without its cost, for though it frees the soul from illusion, it also severs it from the collective dream. The more conscious you become, the more alone you may feel. Not because you disdain others, but because you begin to see through the veil that binds them. You enter conversations and realize there is a choice, one that must be made again and again, to speak your truth and disturb the dream, or to remain silent and preserve the illusion of harmony. Most understandably choose silence, not because they are dishonest, but because they are tired of diluting the vastness of their thoughts into fragments small enough to fit the confines of polite conversation, tired of translating soul-level truths into digestible, inoffensive phrases, tired of watching the eyes of others glaze over, not with judgment, but with disinterest. And so a kind of psychic fatigue sets in, not of the body, but of the spirit. The constant act of becoming legible to those who do not want to read you becomes a weight, and slowly you begin to fracture. There is the self you show, measured, agreeable, palatable, and the self you know, wild, questioning, vast. This is the beginning of the inner split, the exile of the authentic self. But here lies the deeper truth. Much of what we call connection is not connection at all. It is projection, a mutual exchange of images, not essences. People do not meet you as you are. They meet you as they need you to be, a mirror for their longings, a container for their stories, a prop in their personal mythology. And if you are wise, if you are sensitive, if you are psychologically awake, you will feel this discrepancy. You will sense that most relationships are built not on mutual knowing, but on mutual illusion. This realization can be devastating until you see it for what it is, an invitation, not to isolate, but to individuate, to withdraw, not from love, but from illusion, to seek not applause, but alignment, not attention, but authentic resonance. And in that sacred solitude, the self begins to return, not as a persona, but as a presence, not as what others need you to be, but as who you truly are. They're not loving you, they're loving the idea of you. An image, a projection, something safe, digestible, and familiar, shaped not by who you are, but by what they need you to be. And once this becomes clear, Truly clear, the impulse to maintain shallow bonds begins to dissolve. Not out of cruelty, not out of arrogance, but because the soul can no longer afford the energy it takes to perform. I saw that the deeper the psyche travels into its own depths, the more it begins to crave essence over appearance, truth over comfort, few over many. For the psychologically awake, quantity becomes unbearable noise, and quality becomes the only nourishment the soul can accept. This gravitation toward fewer, deeper relationships is not a social preference. It is a psychic necessity. To remain embedded in constant superficiality is to risk the erosion of the self, and so the intelligent person, particularly one with emotional and symbolic awareness, begins to detach. Not because they lack love, but because they have too much of it to spend it on what does not truly connect. You see, there is a certain kind of exhaustion that only those who perceive deeply will understand, an exhaustion that comes not from the world itself, but from trying to make sense of it. They watch with quiet despair as people choose validation over integrity, comfort over truth, emotion over reflection, and belonging over becoming. This produces what Jung might call a psychic tension, a kind of inner dissonance that becomes unbearable to carry without solitude. He warned of the dangers of the collective unconscious, the inherited patterns of thought and behavior that move through societies like ghostly currents. Most people are swept away by them, unaware, but a few awaken. A few develop enough self-awareness to step outside the tide. And once you are outside, you do not return easily, because to go back would mean to pretend, to smile when you mean to question, to conform when your soul was made to create. This is what modern psychology calls cognitive isolation, but Jung would recognize it as something deeper, a natural result of individuation, the soul's journey toward wholeness, toward becoming what it is destined to become, regardless of whether the world understands or applauds it. And here lies the paradox of the awakened mind. It is both more connected to the depths of humanity and more isolated from its surface, not because it chooses loneliness, but because it chooses truth. And truth, in a world addicted to illusion, will always be a lonely road, but a sacred one. There is a kind of exile that leaves no physical trace. You sit among others, speaking, nodding, smiling, yet you are somewhere else entirely. Not absent, but elsewhere, not aloof, but quietly observing a world that seems to be moving on a different axis than your own. This is not arrogance, it is awareness. The intelligent mind does not simply experience awareness. The intelligent mind does not simply experience the world, it dissects it. Every conversation becomes a tapestry of unconscious motivations, logical inconsistencies, projected fears, and inherited assumptions. The mind doesn't just hear what is said, it hears why it was said. It hears the trauma behind the joke, the insecurity behind the opinion, the shadow behind the performance of confidence. I called it the burden of consciousness. The more a person awakens, the more they begin to see not just with the eyes, but with the soul. And what they see often isolates them. For most people, a conversation is just a conversation. For the psychologically aware, it is a labyrinth, a dance of archetypes, projections, and deeply embedded complexes. And so they begin to withdraw, not because they do not long for connection, but because true connection becomes rare, buried beneath layers of social ritual, emotional theater, and collective conditioning. This is not detachment for its own sake. It is protection. It is a way to preserve inner clarity in a world that rewards noise. It is the refusal to dissolve into the collective, to maintain the sanctity of one's own thought amid the deafening echo of groupthink. Is the beginning of the path of individuation when a person, burdened by too much awareness, must turn inward to find truth. Because once you see the archetypes at play, once you notice the child longing for approval in the CEO, the abandoned lover in the political zealot, the tyrant in the victim's clothing, you can no longer unsee them. You walk through the world like a lucid dreamer among sleepwalkers, and this creates a peculiar kind of loneliness, not the absence of people, but the absence of depth, not the lack of conversation, but the lack of meaning. The intelligent person begins to recognize the emotional economy of the psyche. They see how some offer connection only when it costs them nothing. They sense the transactions hidden within friendships, love, and even empathy. And when you see this, you cannot help but withdraw from what feels false, even if it means standing alone. But solitude, Jung reminds us, is not the enemy, it is the crucible of the self. It is the sacred container in which integration begins. When you can no longer find resonance in the outer world, you are called to build resonance within. This is where the detachment leads, not into bitterness, but into individuation, not away from love, but toward a deeper, truer version of it. To be intelligent is to carry a wound, the wound of seeing too much, feeling too deeply, and asking questions that others have silenced within themselves. But it is also to carry a gift, the capacity to descend beyond the mask, to stand at the threshold between the personal and the collective, and to become what others fear to confront, a mirror, a flame, a fully conscious human soul. There comes a moment on the path of awakening, a quiet realization that your emotional energy is not infinite. It is not a bottomless well to be drawn from by anyone, nor is it a currency to be spent on every passing encounter. I knew that consciousness requires energy, and not just a little. To be awake, to see, to feel, to discern truth from illusion demands a constant outpouring of subtle attention, and as awareness deepens, the soul begins to grow more selective. Not out of pride, not out of coldness, but out of necessity, the intelligent individual begins to ask, what is worth my presence? What relationship nurtures me and what drains me? Does this connection invite expansion, or merely echo my past? This is not emotional detachment. This is emotional discernment, a form of quiet wisdom that only emerges when the inner life becomes more important than outer performance. You see, many scatter their attention like seeds on barren ground, feeding relationships out of habit, obligation, or fear of loneliness. But the psychologically aware soul knows that true connection is not measured by quantity, but by depth. They would rather sit in silence with one soul who understands than shout across a room full of noise. This is why intelligent people often appear withdrawn. They are not uninterested, they are preserving, they are engaged in a private cost benefit analysis of the soul, not in the transactional sense, but in the deeply human question, will this moment bring me closer to myself or pull me away? Most will never understand this. Society expects availability. It demands presence, emotional predictability, the polite rituals of being social. And when an intelligent person declines the invitation not rudely, but intentionally, they are misunderstood. Labeled cold, aloof, arrogant, when in truth they are practicing something far rarer, psychological mastery. They have learned the difference between emotional reaction and emotional response. They do not act because they are provoked. They act because they have chosen to. They do not chase connection. They cultivate it, deliberately, cautiously, authentically. This inner sovereignty, this refusal to give away one's emotional life to chaos, is not detachment. It is individuation, the sacred path of becoming whole, of reclaiming the self from the thousand false roles we are taught to perform. And so the intelligent soul withdraws, not from life, but from noise. Not from love, but from illusion, not because they feel less, but because they feel too much and have learned to respect that gift. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. The intelligent person is simply choosing not to let that fate be dictated by anyone else's emotional storm. There is a sacred rhythm in detachment, a quiet movement of the soul pulling back, not in bitterness, but in discernment. For the highly intelligent, detachment is not a form of escape. It is a strategy of preservation, a way of protecting the mind's delicate architecture from the noise of unnecessary engagement. It safeguards energy not to hoard it, but to invest it in pursuits that truly matter: the cultivation of insight, the mastery of thought, the long, winding path of individuation. This is not as withdrawal, but as a return to the self, to the original blueprint buried beneath layers of societal conditioning. You see, the intelligent person often walks alone, not because they are incapable of bonding, but because they are aware of the cost of bonding poorly. They've learned that entanglement in the psychic dramas of others can scatter the soul, cloud the intellect, and corrupt the inner voice. This is not detachment born of trauma, but detachment born of clarity. It is the refusal to tether one's mental clarity to the emotional volatility of the unexamined life, and perhaps the most profound expression of this detachment is found in their relationship with solitude. Where others fear being alone, intelligent individuals feel most themselves. They do not confuse solitude with lack. They understand, as Jung once wrote, that the soul would have no rainbow if the eyes had no tears, and no illumination if there were no darkness, no silence, no solitude. Solitude, for the intelligent mind, is not an exile, but a return to one's natural frequency. It is in solitude that the mind stops translating itself to be understood by others. It no longer dilutes its depth to avoid discomfort. It no longer performs to fit in. Instead, it tunes inward to its own symbolic language, its own mythos, its own active imagination. Believe that in silence the unconscious begins to speak, not in sentences, but in symbols, dreams, visions, and moods. This dialogue with the unconscious, this active imagination, is the birthplace of creativity, philosophical insight, and psychological integration. And here lies the paradox. The more a person detaches from the crowd, the more they become connected to their essence. By stepping back from the collective, they step forward into their own depths. They begin to hear the quiet voice of the self, the inner guide buried beneath the noise of social expectation. And from this inner clarity, they choose relationships not from need, but from resonance. Not from fear of being alone, but from love for shared authenticity. You see, while most form connections to escape themselves, the intelligent often withdraw to find themselves. This is a fundamental difference in psychic orientation, one that creates natural misunderstanding. To the average mind, the intelligent person's solitude looks like arrogance. To the emotionally dependent, it looks like rejection, but to the conscious mind, it is spiritual hygiene. They are not avoiding you. They are returning to themselves so that when they do show up, they bring their whole being, not a fragmented mask. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. And becoming requires space. Time stillness, it cannot be done in a crowd, nor in the approval of others. So when you see a man or woman who has learned to love their own company, who can spend days in solitude without complaint, do not pity them. Do not label them broken or distant. They may be closer to wholeness than anyone you know. They have found the cave where the treasure lies, but which can only be entered by those brave enough to be alone with themselves. Observed it not only in his patience, but in himself, this sacred rhythm of retreat, this psychological tide that draws the intelligent mind inward. His greatest insights, the ones that continue to illuminate the depths of modern psychology, did not come from crowds or consensus. They came from solitude, from long hours by the lake at Bollingen, from silent walks through ancient woods, from dialogues not with other men but with his own unconscious. This was not withdrawal from life. This was a deeper engagement with it. The detachment of the intelligent person is not a flaw. It is not a disorder, nor a social deficiency to be corrected. It is a necessary adaptation, an evolved way of being in a world that moves fast, but thinks shallowly. You see, when one lives with heightened awareness, when one perceives beneath the surface of words, beneath the roles, beneath the social scripts, the cost of constant interaction grows heavy, because so much of what passes for connection in the modern world is, in truth, a subtle violence against authenticity, a denial of the self in favor of belonging. But for the individuating soulful, the deep thinker, belonging at the cost of the soul is not worth the price. And so they retreat, not out of arrogance, but out of necessity. To live authentically, one must learn to be alone with their own thoughts, to sort through the symbols of the unconscious, to allow the self to emerge from the shadows cast by family, culture, and expectation. This detachment, then, is not the absence of love, it is the presence of inner truth. For the intelligent individual, the challenge is not to become more social, but to remain open, deliberately, wisely, to the few connections that nourish rather than deplete, to friendships that mirror the soul, not the persona. And for those trying to love or understand such a person, the invitation is this: do not take their solitude as rejection, do not pathologize their distance. It is not you they are avoiding, it is the noise of the world that clouds the voice of the soul. Their detachment is architecture, a structure built for depth, a vessel shaped for inner voyages. Reminded us that individuation, the process of becoming whole, often requires separation from the collective. It demands time in the wilderness. It asks us to sit in silence long enough to hear the whisper of who we truly are. And that whisper cannot be heard in the crowd. So, when you witness a person who steps back, who refuses the frantic pace of collective life, who treasures depth over attention, do not attempt to fix them. Honor them. They may be engaged in the most important work a human can do, the work of becoming whole. For them, detachment is not isolation. It is integration. It is the soil in which the self takes root, and from which all true connection must grow.